with us today. We are, many of you know Conservation Colorado. We're the state's largest environmental organization. We work at the intersection of policy and politics and people to protect our climate, lands, air, water, and communities. And we work across the state, down at the Capitol and in elections. And water is a huge priority for us. It's not a reach to say that water is life, and certainly in the West, that is particularly true. We have a number of threats to this foundational aspect of our life and our environment, and so much that we love about Colorado, not the least of which is drought and climate change, and the forecast for that is to only continue to grow as a problem. But we've also had challenges with Trump's Supreme Court undermining our water quality laws for the entire country. And Colorado's intent, with the support of the AG and others, is to make sure that we are at the forefront of building back those protections for our water quality after the Trump Supreme Court undermined them. And so we want to talk a little bit about that today, and no one better to tell us their take on that than Phil Weiser, our Attorney General. I've had the privilege of knowing Phil for years. He is a strong friend of the organization and the environment, and no surprise, given his championing of communities and the environment, that he won re-election handily and is now in his second term. So we're so excited to have him here with us today. He's going to join for about the first 15 minutes or so. We're going to hear some remarks from him. Then I'll facilitate some Q&A with the Attorney General, and then he'll hop off and I'll turn it over to the rest of our panel. Thank you for being with us today.
It's great to be there, Kelly. Thank you for all your leadership. We're so lucky in Colorado to have you, have Conservation Colorado, and many other committed citizens fighting to protect our land, air, and water. I want to start on this note you mentioned about drought and climate change and what it means for water. We are in what is objectively a terrifying situation. And if we aren't careful, if we aren't smart, resilience, which I believe needs to be a watchword for policy, is going to suffer. We need to recognize that in so many crucial systems, our changing climate is impacting our resilience. So think about wildfires as just one example. We are risking ourselves being more vulnerable to wildfires at the same time that we might be less prepared for them. We've built often a lot of housing right near forests, and that is a risky equation. You can go down other lists of how we try to develop next to natural resources. If we're not protecting our natural resources, we are risking undermining our natural resources. So as we think about an opportunity right now, and you think about, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, there's going to be huge possible investments that if we make them the right way, we're going to help promote resilience. Think about smart water storage, like what's happening up in Weld County, recharging aquifers. That builds more resilience. Or the effort to build better groundwater systems in the San Luis Valley, that builds better resilience. The opposite of those things, draining aquifers or not managing waterways free from pollution, undermines resilience. And we can't afford to be less resilient when it comes to water because we have less water. This should be a compelling message that everyone can accept and everyone gets to work, because we are already behind on these issues. The way we do this in Colorado is also worth emphasizing. We do it together, collaboratively. We need state leadership and we need local leadership, often developing solutions that may be different. I mentioned the San Luis Valley, different issues than if we're looking at how to help address issues in Western Colorado or the Eastern Plains. We can't be asleep. This session, we're going to have a chance to work on one of the issues that's critical around water quality. Before I get to that, I do want to mention one thing we're also working on that I welcome engagement. It's PFAS. When you talk about water quality, it's a conversation that has multiple dimensions, and we need to think on all those dimensions. Many people, for example, when they hear water quality, worry about mines, in some cases that have been abandoned, in some cases that are not being maintained. Very easy to see that pollute our rivers and our streams. There's a lot I can say about that. That's not for this webinar. The next point I want to talk about is PFAS, because we are actively engaging in litigation, and we're going to have to figure out how we remediate and manage our water that we know is already contaminated, in some places much worse than others. When you think about environmental justice, for example, think about what we know to be the case in Commerce City, where it's close to Suncor and their use of PFAS. What does that mean for public health? We need to lean in on these issues. They're companies that really acted irresponsibly, that did not think about the public health, in some cases actively deceive the public. Think about DuPont, and for those who've seen the movie Dark Waters, you know what I'm talking about. We're working hard to hold them accountable, protect public health. The last issue is the main one. It's the saddest one because it's self-inflicted. We passed the Clean Water Act because there was a widespread awareness about how important it is to manage, for public health purposes, our rivers and our streams. There has been a consensus for a long time about what that looked like, and the Environmental Protection Agency had developed this capacity to oversee and permit what you probably heard this phrase, dredge and fill programs. Anytime you're doing development of a wetland, for example, there's going to be potential, maybe likely impacts on the relevant water. And in Colorado, we're in a unique situation because so much of our water isn't the typical, flowing river. Even those of us who see, for example, the Cherry Creek, it is not always flowing. That's Colorado. We have intermittent waterways. It's part of our ecology. Some say actually 2/3 of the waters in Colorado are temporary of this kind. Now, the old rule under the Clean Waters Act, which has a really awkward phrase, waters of the United States, was that if the waterways were temporary, but they were still intricately connected, then there was a ability to oversee those waters for water quality. And that had really been the baseline until the Supreme Court, that is more activist and more dangerous than any court, for a long time. You could argue about the court in the early era of the New Deal called the Lochner Court, if you wanted to come up with a similar rival for a court who doesn't think about the actual consequences of decisions. And I will put in the chat, assuming the chat works, a recent talk I gave, which criticizes the Supreme Court on this dimension. And this is something that I worry about. And when you look at the court from last spring, and what's awkward about this decision was Brett Kavanaugh joined 3 members of the court who are identified as the more liberal end, saying, we're way over our skis here, or pick what metaphor you like. We're way out front of our headlights. And unfortunately, that's exactly where the court was. The court undid or upended this regulatory system that protects public health. And they did it without really thinking hard about the consequences. Here's what the consequences mean for Colorado. We now no longer have a federal partner that we can rely on to protect these waterways and to ensure that any of these activities, again, I mentioned the phrase dredge and fill, are consistent with protecting water quality. And that's a scary proposition, because when you think about Colorado's dependence on our water, if you start undermining water quality, it's obviously a public health issue, but it's more than that. It affects our outdoor recreation economy. It affects a range of our quality of life issues. We need to ensure that there is reliable oversight. And without a federal system in place, because the concept of waters of the United States, that is the foundation of this Clean Water Act that was passed in the early 70s, is now essentially gutted or upended. We in Colorado are going to have to create this system. And that's something that's going to happen this term. We are really concerned about the importance of this. We're committed to getting it right. And we want to make sure that Colorado can actually be one of the states that is a national model for how we take protecting our land, air, and water seriously. And this legislative effort and the attendant enforcement requirements are going to be a part of that. So I can go on, but I would rather do it in a way that's a little bit more interactive. And I know that the great Kelly Nordini has offered to engage in a little bit of that dialogue. So Kelly, let me hand it back to you for a little back and forth. And I guess there is no chat, so I'll just send it to you, Kelly, and then you can figure out when and how to get your members my attendant critique of the Supreme Court, which I'm happy to talk more about if you have questions as well.
Yeah, that would be great. We would love to be able to share that with folks. So you talked about, we're going to work on this upcoming session and hopefully keeping Colorado at the forefront of making sure we are not at the mercy of this Trump Supreme Court rolling back our clean water laws. What would it look like if the legislature wasn't successful? What's at risk? Can you just talk a little bit more about some of the downsides you could see and why I know you've been so passionate about moving quickly on this?
We have historical benchmarks. We have to go back to pre-1970 to a lack of oversight. And I'm someone who believes deeply in the importance of responsible regulatory oversight. We developed a new model of regulatory oversight in the 1970s to protect our land, air, and water. And before that, you had lots of bad actors who were operating in ways in which they could undermine public health, literally dump pollutants into water, and we didn't have an ability to prevent it from happening. The old model was entirely after the fact. In fact, it was often you'd have to bring like a nuisance action against somebody, and it's a lot less effective. If you can have rules up front, which is here's what responsible development looks like, you show us you're doing it, we'll give you a permit. And I'm really committed to ensuring the permitting regime is as efficient, as transparent, and as highly functional as possible. But if you have no such protective system on the front end, and all you have is the ability to go after someone after the fact, the damage is done, which can harm public health, obviously kill wildlife, harm ecosystems. And then the question is, are you going to be able to actually take that after the fact action? Sometimes you've got actors who are bad actors who kind of do the damage, leave, and you can't find them. So to me, it's a really scary thought. If you remove the system we have now, you're removing protections, you're playing with fire that people are going to act responsibly, which we know from history hasn't always happened. And then you're betting on the ability to essentially compensate after the fact, which I would even call that a second best solution. It's a much worse solution. And so I am nervous, Kelly, if we don't have action, what will happen and what we're putting ourselves at the mercy of.
Yeah, me too. So it's going to be a huge priority for us this year. I see a question here about who's responsible for protecting the water? Who owns it? How does this work? How does it land with the state?
The concept that I believe we have developed is a sense of stewardship. And when you think about land, air, and water, public land in particular, air quality, and water quantity, there is a public interest that the state needs to vindicate. It is not plausible to say, I own this property, so I can do something that will pollute the groundwater and harm others. Economists would call that a negative externality. So the state has the interest and the obligation of stewardship here. And for years, we had a partnership with the federal government where we could essentially cooperate with them, and they did this work. That's now been gutted. So now it's on the state and the state alone. It used to be more of a cooperative system. Now it's a exclusively state system because of the Supreme Court decision.
Great, that's helpful. And obviously that stewardship role is really critical for the state to step in. Do you know of other states who are addressing this undermining of federal protections and taking this on?
Yeah, many states are in the category. I'd say there's three categories. One is there's some states that had basically got out front of the EPA and said, we want to do all this ourselves. And that's an option that states have always had. Some states chose to exercise that option. I think California's in that situation. Second, there are some states who are doing what I just said I don't want us to do. They're playing with fire, saying, okay, no federal protection anymore. We'll take our chances. And I find that to be a scary proposition. I don't want Colorado to do it. I don't believe we will do it. But there's some states where that's what they're going to do. And then many states are in, probably most states are in that intermediate position where we are right now figuring out how do we build a state regulatory system that we haven't had to before to operate in this area. And we will work hard to understand what we learned from other states who are doing it, how we develop best practices. I want Colorado to be a leader, as we are in so many areas when it comes to protecting our land, air, and water and addressing climate change. I believe this is another area that we can and we should lead in.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that question of leadership. All right, I'm seeing a question here. Are you doing any efforts on embodied water and water productivity in ag?
So I will look forward to learning what embodied water means. That's not a term I've heard before. Kelly, can you educate me and others? Okay.
I did not. I'm seeing here in the chat that we're going to address this one later in the webinar with our panelist.
Right. So given that I don't know what the term embodied water means, and I look forward to learning it, maybe I'll let the panelists address it. But I will say on a different point, we need to make sure we're working with all communities and all water users around responsible stewardship and responsible water management practices. That's been a core tradition in Colorado. It's one that is super important. And there's a range of opportunities. And I wrote a letter to a water drought task force that was looking at, particularly on the Colorado River. One I mentioned is around artificial intelligence and sensoring technologies. How do we build better capacity? You can measure water usage, you can evaluate water quality now in real-time basis, so that you could imagine situations where if we detect disturbances or potential pollutants, we can actually act quickly to protect broader waterways from being contaminated. That sort of, again, resilience or adaptive management is something that I am keen for us to explore. We have to be on the cutting edge here, and we have to act with a sense of urgency because of how important this is.
Yeah. Thank you. And we will get to that other question later in the panel. I am also interested to learn what embodied water is. Okay, last question, Mr. Attorney General. So given that this is the majority of our watersheds that are at risk in Colorado, what do you need from us to get this done? How do we help?
First and foremost, and I know this is an open door with all of those here and with Conservation Colorado, we can't be silent during the legislative session. There are sometimes companies, other interests who say, I just as soon not have any regulation at all, and you can trust me. It's fair to say that lessons from history suggest otherwise, that if you are a trustworthy company, then you're going to accept responsible regulation and you'll recognize this environmental stewardship obligation. But not every company is going to act that way. And we need a system in place in Colorado, and the legislature has to enact one this session. So there's going to be an effort. It's important that people's voices are loud and clear, that we must do this. And insofar as there's some areas that reasonable people can have discussion about, that's fine. There are different ways to set up a permitting regime. That's a reasonable conversation. Should we do something on this? There's no, my mind, reasonable stance that no, we should just take our chances. So make sure that your voice is heard, make sure that you're engaged. And then when it comes to how we manage this system, I'm a big fan of saying our democracy is not a spectator sport, it's a team sport. Water is all of our business. How we protect water quality, how we manage our water. We need everyone's engagement, ideas, thoughts, efforts at the table. This issue is not going anywhere. Water is precious to us in Colorado. It is our lifeblood. And so stay engaged, be thoughtful, educate me and others on what embodied water and other terms mean, and help us develop the solutions that will make Colorado a leader. I really believe Colorado needs to be a nationwide leader. This will also be an economic driver for us when you think about water innovation and what's happening with the CSU Spur effort and other conversations. There's so much here for us to lead on and to be excited about. Let's make sure to be the standard bearer that our nation needs us to be.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. We really appreciate it, your time today. And it's obvious from hearing you talk why you are such a good friend of the organization and our environment here in Colorado. So thank you so much. We're going to let you get on fighting bad guys and go fight win. And we'll continue with the rest of our panel here. Thanks very
Great.
much.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, I'm gonna turn it to our fabulous Anna out of our Grand Junction office. We love our Grand Junction outposts and all they bring to the work. So Anna, take it away.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you so much. Big shout out to Attorney General Weiser for taking the time to educate us all and for sharing his insights on this issue. Like Kelly said, my name is Anna Hinojosa. I'm a West Slope organizer with Conservation Colorado, based in Grand Junction. And today I'm going to move us over to our next section of the event. We have 3 fantastic speakers with us today. And what they're going to do for us is they're going to dive a little bit more into the details of the issue, as well as share some of the solutions that they're working on. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you all Stu Gillespie, who is the supervising senior attorney with EarthJustice's Rocky Mountain office in Denver, Colorado. His practice focuses on protecting our public lands and wildlife while ensuring clean water for all. We also have today Alex Funk, who serves as the Director of Water Resources and Senior Counsel for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, where he focuses on advancing federal and state policies to conserve and restore fish and wildlife habitat and promote innovative solutions to challenges facing Western watersheds. And last but not least, we have Juan Madrid, who is a policy advocate with Green Latinos. He has been involved in research on how climate change-driven drought in the Southwest has been impacting the physical and mental health of farmers and ranchers in the Colorado River Basin. And without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to our speakers.
Terrific, Anna. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm Stu Gillespie, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be on such a great panel. And obviously want to thank AG Weiser for Colorado's leadership on this key issue. So I'd like to cover kind of 3 main things in my quick talk. First, I wanted to give you all a little bit more of an overview of the Clean Water Act, which has just been a tremendous force in protecting our nation's waters. And we really need to understand what the Clean Water Act has long done to protect those waters so that we really understand what's at stake and what we've now lost. I'd then like to transition into the Sackett decision by the Supreme Court and really talk about how that's kneecapped the Clean Water Act. This was truly a hit job, as AG Weiser explained, and it threatens our waterways, it threatens our communities, it threatens our way of lives. And then finally, I wanted to end with kind of 2 main takeaways on next steps, really keying in on some of the actions that Colorado can take to step into the void created by Sackett, protect our waters, and protect our communities. And then obviously there'll be a Q&A, so looking forward to any questions that folks have, and I'll obviously try to respond to those. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 at a time where our rivers, streams, and wetlands were literally open dumps filled with industrial waste. And so if you went back in time, you'd find that some of the nation's rivers were literally on fire due to that industrial waste, such as the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. And so Congress recognized this problem. It was a widespread problem, and there was bipartisan support to pass the Clean Water Act over the veto of President Nixon at the time. And Congress passed the Clean Water Act with an ambitious purpose, and that was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. And this was truly a comprehensive, far-reaching goal. And to do that, Congress really took on that task because it recognized that it needed to take a watershed approach to protecting waters due to the connectivity of our nation's streams, wetlands, and rivers. And so if you think about a watershed, such as a watershed here in Colorado, you have those headwater streams that collect rains and storms and convey those flows and those nutrients downstream into the main tributaries. And along the way, there are also wetlands along those streams that capture flood flows, so they prevent downstream flooding by retaining waters. So for example, one wetland can hold over 1 million gallons of water at 1 acre of wetlands. And they also filter those waters so that when those streams run downstream and become drinking water sources, that water is already being filtered. It's already ready and available for all sorts of different uses. And ultimately, we're all downstream of these waterways, particularly here in Colorado, which is a headwater state. And this is really something we all know. When you think about it, this is a land where life is written in water. And so Colorado has within its boundaries the headwaters of 5 major multi-state streams. Those are the Platte, Arkansas, Republican, Rio Grande, and Colorado rivers. And these rivers supply millions of people with water in 19 downstream states in Mexico. And that water is used for agriculture, drinking, industries, and recreation. And these Colorado headwaters, they're also critical for habitat. And that's something that I know Alex is going to really touch on in his presentation as well. They provide key habitats for species and all sorts of other life forms. So what the Clean Water Act does, or it did, was to regulate pollution at its source. And it strictly prohibits the discharge of any pollutant into a protected water without a permit. And so if you fail to get a permit, you could be subject to an enforcement action, including civil and even criminal penalties. And so for years, the Clean Water Act has really been an invisible force protecting our waterways. So let's say you're a refinery that was discharging waste into a waterway. You needed to get a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or Environmental Protection Agency. Or likewise, if you were a mining company that wanted to develop a mine in a headwater stream or wetland, you had to get a permit. You had to play by the rules. And those permitting requirements triggered a broad array of environmental laws designed to protect the environment. So you'd have to undertake a comprehensive analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, Procedures Act, where you would look at all of the implications of the discharge of that pollutant and the development of, say, that mine. You would also have to comply with the Endangered Species Act to ensure that the project wasn't threatening the survival of any listed or endangered species or degrading their critical habitat. And you had to go through other procedural requirements. You would have to engage in consultation with tribal communities to make sure you weren't impairing or degrading any cultural resources. And so all these permitting requirements, they played a crucial role in protecting our nation's waters. And the Act truly has been a tremendous success for the past 50 years. It's undeniable. But that success has also invited pushback, and it's turned the Clean Water Act into a target for the conservative agenda to roll back the federal government and its ability to protect our environment. And so for years, there's been litigation over the scope of the Act and precisely what waters it protects. And when you go back in time and look at the Clean Water Act, Congress clearly intended it to have a comprehensive scope because that's what was needed to protect the integrity of our nation's waters. But the Supreme Court entirely ignored that purpose, and it effectively rewrote the Clean Water Act to gut those protections by severely narrowing and constraining the scope of the Act's protections. So where the Act would have protected all waters that had a significant nexus to downstream waterways, so let's say you had a headwater stream where if you discharged a pollutant into it, that would go down and impair a downstream waterway, that would have been protected. Congress wanted federal agencies to regulate that source. The Supreme Court has since cut back on those protections and narrowed them down so that source may no longer be protected. And so by most estimates, the Sackett decision has eliminated protections for over 100 million acres of wetlands and hundreds of thousands of miles of streams, including many intermittent streams. And that's particularly problematic in states like Colorado here in the West. As Attorney General Weiser mentioned in his remarks, a lot of the waterways in Colorado are intermittent. They don't flow year-round. And that seems to be something that the Supreme Court has entirely ignored by suggesting that those waterways may not be covered. But we know those waterways are really the crucial arteries of these watersheds and need those protections. And so really, I want to kind of end here in the few minutes I've got with 2 real key takeaways from what this Sackett decision means going forward. First and foremost is the bad news, and that's the fact that the decision is really an invitation to pollute waters. And what it sets up is kind of a framework where industries going forward will discharge now and ask questions later. And That's because there's often no longer a requirement to even get a permit at the federal level, the way the Supreme Court has narrowed the Clean Water Act. And as Attorney General Weiser noted, few states have the ability to fill that gap. They actually don't even have programs in place to require permits for industries to discharge into wetlands, such as here in Colorado. And so what's happened is we've taken a huge step back in time. And I think that what that requires of us is to be extra vigilant going forward, to make sure that we have folks on the ground who are monitoring our waterways, who are making sure that polluters don't get off scot-free, and that are making sure that we make sure that they remain accountable and don't get away with a free pass. And then the second thing I really wanted to highlight was how this is an opportunity to really build back the Clean Water Act from the states up to the federal level. And protecting clean water is something that inspires broad support. This was a bipartisan issue back in 1972. It's still a hugely popular issue among the public. And that gives me a lot of hope, and especially with states like Colorado that are taking a leadership role. And one thing that Colorado already has is it already has a very broad definition of waters that can be protected under state law. Effectively, Colorado can, should, and must fill the gap created by SACIT by setting up its own dredge and fill program and ensuring that any discharges into waters of the state, Colorado waterways, are regulated, reviewed, and obtain the necessary permits to protect our waters, our communities, and habitat for species. And I think that if we do this right, as Attorney General Weiser mentioned, if we make sure that the state does this right, it can be a model for future states across the country. And that's something that we all need to be a part of. We need to be in these meetings going forward, making sure that the state is doing this right, and that this will in fact serve as an example for other states to follow suit. So with that, I want to turn it over to Alex and look forward to questions at the end of the discussion.
Thanks, Stu. And hi, everyone. My name is Alex Funk. I'm the Director of Water Resources with an organization called the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And I'm based here in Denver and run our freshwater policy program. And if you're not familiar with us, we are a national organization that works primarily around sort of hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation conservation work, and have been engaged on sort of this issue on both the federal and state level here in Colorado. So I'm going to try to build on what Stu just touched on, kind of talk a little bit about the implications of the recent Supreme Court decision, and talk a little bit about what's happening at the federal and state level to address that. So I guess next slide. So just real briefly, and again, kind of building on Stu's points, so wetlands and streams are absolutely crucial ecosystems, especially in states like Colorado, more semi-arid or arid states, where, wetlands and streams have, a disproportionate, impact on biodiversity and wildlife, despite their kind of small presence on the landscape. And that includes, really important game species, including, turkey, grouse, waterfowl, our native cutthroat trout. These are all sort of really critically important to the hunting, angling, and sort of outdoor recreation community. And that's big dollars. So, hunting and fishing alone, brings in over $3 billion to Colorado annually. It supports, about 25,000 jobs. And then when you kind of build that out to recreation generally, as high as $19 billion for the state of Colorado. So, and, really without these ecosystems, we wouldn't really have those benefits. And so it's really important that we kind of figure out how we protect these resources. Next slide. So just to kind of, again, touch on a few things that other speakers have noted, the Clean Water Act, prior to the Supreme Court decision earlier this year, the congressional intent and kind of historic, sort of interpretation of the scope of the Clean Water Act has always been fairly broad. Certainly broader than, just flowing rivers or large rivers and streams. But, when Congress worked on this piece of legislation and subsequent Supreme Court decisions, a broad set of waters have been protected. So everything from, interstate rivers like the South Platte, which is up there in the corner with Elitch in the background, to, tributaries such as the Blue River, which is down at the bottom there, to floodplain wetlands, to interstate lakes, and all the way up to our headwaters, especially when they had that kind of significant influence on those downstream waters, all historically, have been recognized under the Clean Water Act regulations and by courts in terms of being protected under the Clean Water Act. Next slide. But as others have mentioned, the Supreme Court decision really guts that to a large degree. So like national estimates, somewhere in the ballpark of 63% of the wetlands across the country are no longer protected following the Supreme Court decision in Sackett. Millions of miles of smaller order, streams that in our headwaters that only run occasionally during the year. And again, wetlands that aren't, necessarily, directly abutting a flowing river. And so these are just some of the examples, from here in Colorado that, could potentially be impacted by this. So play lakes, which are, kind of critical stopover sites for migratory birds on the Eastern Plains and are largely groundwater dependent, likely no longer protected. We've got kettle ponds, we've got fens, these headwater streams that only flow in response to, either precipitation events or very groundwater dependent. All of these are now at risk. And as Attorney General Weiser was mentioning, that's a significant portion of Colorado's waterways, potentially, as high as 2/3. And then the other sort of kicker in the decision, and kind of what that photo on the bottom left is trying to show is, wetlands that are now separated from, either a flowing river or lake by like a man-made structure like a road or other natural feature, are also no longer protected. Because really what the Supreme Court majority opinion said is that, basically for the Clean Water Act to apply, there has to be kind of this continuous water connection, surface water connection between that wetland or stream feature to, one of those larger, river systems. And so again, in a state like ours, which is, predominantly more arid and has a bunch of smaller stream systems, and not a lot of large flowing rivers, a lot of our aquatic resources are now at risk. Next slide. So what's happening in response to the Supreme Court decision? So there's certainly a mix of sort of federal and state efforts at play. And, just kind of briefly touching on the federal side, there's, already some work, underway to kind of, how can we, work to increase funding for voluntary wetland and stream conservation programs. So, a number of federal agencies offer funding for things like conservation easements, or to acquire, habitat under things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, for example. And so those programs, certainly have become all the more important as a way to sort of ensure that we are permanently protecting some of those programs. But those voluntary programs are also pretty oversubscribed, and aren't gonna they're not gonna be able to cover that or address that sort of minimum floor protection that the Clean Water Act was providing. The other big push that's happening a lot at the state level, or we're talking about, or at the federal level, is certainly more funding for states and tribes. States like Colorado are now kind of in the driver's seat in terms of kind of developing protective solutions, but those programs cost money and require more capacity. And so there are some federal programs that can help support that, but they are fairly small. And so how do we kind of think about enhancing resources there? And then ultimately, Congress, Congress is going to have to fix this issue, likely through some process by amending the Clean Water Act itself, to essentially redefine that waters as a U.S. term and to include some more specific protections for a broader set of waters, which was, again, the intent with the original Clean Water Act. And there has been legislation introduced in the House. That's the Clean Water Act of 2023, which would basically do that. It amends the Clean Water Act in a way that just provides a little more prescriptive nature to what waters are in fact protected, as well as codifying some other exemptions and exclusions from the Clean Water Act. So that is legislation that's been introduced. The challenge is that this Congress and other Congresses, certainly this remains sort of kind of a politically, challenging issue, and it's going to take some time for that federal fix to really materialize. But it is important. But in the meantime, next slide. That's why it's so important that states like Colorado really take a leadership role, because as we kind of work on that long-term federal solution, states are really going to have to step in to really, strengthen their wetland protection efforts. And so, and that kind of, again, runs across the board. The most important, and what we've been talking a lot about today, is Colorado's effort to stand up its own, state wetland and stream permitting program, which essentially would create sort of a state level, dredge and fill, kind of protective, process that, again, is more encompassing of Colorado's unique aquatic features and ecosystems, and again, potentially broader than what's certainly now protected under the Clean Water Act. But other things like increasing voluntary funding, helping local governments develop ordinances that protect wetlands and streams. Boulder County has some of those, Park County, and then just education and outreach on this issue are also going to be critical. But so I'll just say, like, there's certainly a lot of work to be done, both at that federal and state level. That federal fix is super important. So, definitely reach out to your reps and senators about that opportunity. But in the meantime, Colorado is really showing a lot of leadership in this area, potentially setting up this program, and it's going to need a lot of support. And so, definitely looking forward to kind of continuing this conversation and letting folks know how they can kind of engage on this issue. I think with that, we're turning it over to Juan.
All right, there's that pesky mute button. Juan Roberto Madrid with Green Latinos Colorado. I'm one of the advocates for clean transportation and clean energy for our Colorado team. Green Latinos is a national nonprofit environmental conservation organization, and our mission is being an active comunidad of Latino, Latina, Latinx leaders emboldened by the power and wisdom of our culture, united to demand equity and dismantle racism, resourced to win our environmental, conservation, and climate justice battles, and driven to secure our political, economic, cultural, and environmental liberation. So with that being said, right, we're advocating for environmental conservation and environmental justice as it impacts Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities that we serve. We are a membership-driven organization, and so much of what drives our work is what is important to our members. And so in Colorado, it's what's important to our members across the state in Colorado here. And so at Green Latinos, our members, and we believe the Clean Water Act has had done a great job in protecting water supplies. And so we want to highlight and emphasize the things that Alex and Stu have mentioned, and how rolling back those protections not only hurts all Coloradans, but also hurts disproportionately impacted communities that suffer environmental injustices already. It burdens them even more. Want to highlight how pollution and the impacts of climate do not impact all communities in the same way, and thus how disproportionately impacted communities like Commerce City, North Denver, that are in an area where you have a refinery, a rail yard, and you have heavy trucking essentially the equivalent of an inland port because you have commerce coming in and out. So they have poor air quality, they have poor water quality, and they're already living in those conditions. And then reminding the audience that you can take action by getting engaged as this legislative process goes forward, as Alex has talked about, as Stu has talked about, as the Attorney General Weiser has said, right? It's your opportunity to become active and get involved in supporting the legislation that comes through. This issue is important to Green Latinos because our communities rely on wetlands for mitigation of flood damages, for filtration of pollutants in source water, and much, much more. Alex gave the example of the waters around Suncor and how those are polluted, right? So that's an example of how a community, disproportionately impacted community, is in an area where they're already suffering poor air quality, degraded water quality, and they're burdened by having to go out and pay more for drinkable water, potable water, right? So that's a concern and an issue for us in our communities. With well over half of the country's wetlands losing protections, disinvested communities, BIPOC communities, indigenous communities, and rural communities are all going to have less protection from flooding, from source water contamination, pollution, and drought caused by irresponsible development. So we are concerned, and that's why we're here to engage in the process and help support a robust legislative process that will help address these issues. Earlier, right, that we were talking about the decision by the Supreme Court to roll back the Clean Water Act. And that act has helped communities around the country improve water quality for over 50 years. Colorado is in the midst of, we have been in the midst of our worst drought. Some folks who say, well, last winter was a great winter. We had a great snowpack, but we still ended up short. And one good winter does not erase 20 years of, or 22 years of drought. And so that is also eliminating protections from our water supply, right? So as that water supply dwindles and as these protections are being eroded, then that causes problems for communities like the communities we serve. If communities of color don't stand up if we don't stand up a program to restore protections, communities of color, especially in lower income areas, disproportionately burdened by high water treatment costs and are disproportionately at risk for flood-induced damages, will suffer more. We need strong protections to prevent those communities from bearing the brunt of polluted drinking water and climate-induced superfloods. Many in Colorado are currently disproportionately impacted by pollution and climate change. For quite some time, we've been hearing concerns about odor, taste of the water, color of the water. The removal of this protections is one more layer that will impact these disproportionately impacted communities even more. And these are our communities that are most vulnerable. So to avoid these disproportionate impacts, we must pass legislation this year, and we need everybody in the audience to speak out about the importance of the issue and get engaged and get involved. I think we can kick it to Anna for any questions for a Q&A, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Juan, and thank you all for that super informative discussion. I think we have some time for a few questions. So in case you're not familiar or you're trying to ask a question, you have to put that onto the Q&A chat section. That's the only place where we're able to see them. So please go ahead and do that. And we already have some questions, so I'll go ahead and get us started here. First question is for Juan. And this says, there was an article today on the Colorado Sun that highlighted thousands lapse water pollution permits regarding citing issues with staffing and resources issues at CDPHE and an EPA backlog. Why are we allowing state and federal agencies to shrink their responsibility at the expense of our water resources?
Yeah, great question. And at Green Latinos, we are aware of, though I haven't read the article that came out today, at Green Latinos, we are aware of many of these self-reported violations. There was a report that was done with Green Latinos and the University of Colorado School of Public Health, in which they identified over 180 self-identified polluters, identified how they were self-polluting, and nothing has been done by CDPHE. Of course, right, citing staffing issues and backlogs. This impacts disproportionately impacted communities again, right? Because now those protections aren't being, those violations they're not being corrected, right? And those communities are suffering even more than they already have. And so that's why it's important that we get this new legislation passed so that we can start to address that, those sources and the protections for our wetlands.
Great. Thank you, Juan. The next question is for Alex, and this says, what coalitions and or boards exist that are the best starting point to build a state regulatory commission to do what you're suggesting? And after that, what is the process being suggested to build the necessary regulation and protection, and what can citizens do?
Thanks, Anna. I'll take a stab at it. So in terms of the state regulatory commission, so there's certainly some ongoing discussion on which state agency might potentially take on the role of setting up such a program. Both the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and Natural Resources have been sort of mentioned in that conversation. We think CDPHE's experience in sort of the permitting realm and the fact that they already handle other Clean Water Act programs, it probably makes the most sense for them to also administer this program. And they have been the one sort of convening dialogue around how this might work in Colorado. So that Water Quality Control Commission is, sort of front and center in terms of that, and would sort of kind of set that overarching vision for such a program. That said, I mean, there are certainly other sort of like, local government and other bodies that, certainly could potentially play a role here. In terms of the process, I mean, I think the two big steps, and this is all just sort of, crystal balling a little bit, but, the state is certainly acknowledges that it needs legislative authority to set up this program, to kind of give them the power to actually operate it and enforce it. And so that will require legislation. And that, I think Juan and others mentioned that might come as soon as this legislative session is the guess. And then there will likely be some conversations around, essentially a follow-up rulemaking. So if that legislation gets passed, there will be some elements in the legislation that will probably need more interpretation by the agency itself or maybe details. And so likely a kind of summer, later year rulemaking process as well. So kind of a two-parter, in terms of that. And I will also be remiss in not mentioning there's a budget ask that's been put forward by the agency, getting back to that capacity issue. Again, this program isn't necessarily, it's going to need resources to really do what it needs to do. And so there's also kind of a separate budgetary ask that will also be super important to getting this program stood up and implemented.
Great, thank you, Alex. This next question is for Stu, and somebody's asking, do you see the state's potential dredge and fill permit program applying to all wetlands in the state, or mimicking the previous federal definition of waters of the US, which excluded some isolated wetlands?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. So it really goes to how Colorado has to step in and take leadership here. And we heard that straight from Attorney General Phil Weiser. And what that requires is the state to regulate as broadly as it can to protect wetlands, streams, rivers, and to ensure that you have comprehensive protections, because that's what's necessary to protect the watershed, to protect water quality, to protect those downstream communities, including those that are disproportionately impacted. So I think there's, under the state definition of waters, they can broadly protect wetlands. And I know that there are some bends and other isolated wetlands that play crucial ecological roles, and also often have connections to the major tributaries and streams and rivers. And I think the state should be making sure that its dredge and fill program for wetlands includes those water bodies, those wetlands, and it's not limited to those that have, say, a significant nexus, and certainly is not limited to those that have a continuous surface connection. Because if the state narrows down the scope of its protections, then it's not going to fill that gap created by SACIT. And then we're not going to have a solution. And if we don't have some sort of solution at the state level, that's going to leave, as I said, that gap for polluters to come in to either fill those wetlands or discharge waste into them. And that's something that needs to be tied up tight. And so I think the state really needs to take a lead on this. And that's where folks like everyone on this call can be engaged in the legislation and in the rulemaking. And you can be out there in your communities, in your watersheds, making sure that these wetlands are not left open to destruction.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stu. And I know, folks have a lot of questions. We would be happy to follow up with you. And I can leave my contact information in the chat in case you are interested in following up. But I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you so much, Alex, Stu, Juan, for those incredible, super informative, that incredible presentation. That was super informative and really dug deep into the issue. And I hope for folks out there watching, I hope the biggest takeaway is that we need legislation, right? Like it's just a necessity at this point, and we need it now. Whether, you're here because you are an outdoor recreationist and enjoy the river, or because you care about environmental justice and are part of a disproportionately impacted community, regardless, I think we can all agree that this is a concerning issue and that we need to take action now. Certainly, after the SACIT decision, much of our state's water are now vulnerable, and we absolutely need federal protections. That's, there's no question in that. However, the quickest first step we can take is for Colorado to step up and take advantage of this opportunity to be a leader and to protect our water. So I want to encourage you all to make your voice heard, right? We're going to put a link in the chat here right now. Great, easy opportunity for you to use your voices right now while the knowledge is fresh and while you just heard all of this information. All you have to do is click this link. It's going to ask for some basic information, and it's going to do this email. It's going to have this email that is urging legislators to take action on this issue. So, with just 5 minutes of your time entering your information, this email is going to be sent out to your legislators. This is just a fantastic opportunity to get involved and use your very powerful voices. And for those of you that are a little bit hesitant and like, how much power or how much of an impact can my message have? Trust us, when we have a lot of people doing it and when folks are activated and putting this on the radars of the legislators and being passionate about it, it goes a really long way. So please, if you have a few minutes, sign that or get that email sent out. And just really quickly, thank you all again so much for being here. Thank you to our panelists, Alex, to Juan. Thank you so much to Kelly and the AG Weiser for being here. And I hope we continue to work with you all to, address this important issue. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.